What is the difference between knowing a lot about a person and actually knowing that person?
When we're thinking about regular human affairs, it's easier. So we should start there maybe. We have this concept of knowing someone versus knowing about someone. You can observe someone from afar like a spy might do, right? Imagine a movie in which there's like a spy that's learning a lot about their sort of whatever mark, their target, the person. But it's important that they never interact with them. They never show that they are being spied on. And so that kind of individual can learn quite a bit, maybe very intimate details about that person. And let's suppose they're learning facts about them, but the facts are the kind of thing you could relay to someone else by testimony pretty easily, right? They could tell their other spy colleague or whatever, today my guy went to the store and today he wore an orange jacket, or like whatever. And so you can tell someone else a lot about someone who's never even seen them or had any perceptual contact with them. But even you can have perceptual contact and learn a lot about someone, and you don't yet haven't done the right things that would count as starting to know them in a relational way. There's these things you can know a lot about from afar, someone, but there's something you got to do to get to know them or relate to them, which has, in my view of things, has at least two features that are really important. One is that you are engaging with them and they're engaging back, so it's reciprocating. But the way in which each of you are engaging each other requires a kind of a second personal modality, where it's I'm doing something that's treating you as a you. It's like I treat you as a subject, as a you, as someone to whom my thoughts or my attitudes, my emotions are given in a kind of, especially the conversation is the paradigm. But I don't think we should suppose it's only a conversational thing. We could talk about that if you want later. I mean, here's a toy case that might help you get the feeling of this, right? Imagine some people having a conversation and someone else who maybe one of them knows but the other one doesn't, like creeps in and tries to join the conversation. And suppose one of them, or maybe both of them, just totally ignore them. or even they might do something like talk about them in the third person without addressing them.
Yeah.
Right? That's a way in which they're going to feel like ignored, disrespected. But notice all these normative notions come online precisely because there's a difference between acknowledging someone's existence or something and addressing them, or like including them in the we are talking as I to you. Right? There's this deeper thing, and this probably pulls us much more away from philosophy and more into the land of psychology and therapy and so on. But there's another thing, which is once I've gotten to meet you or get to know you slightly, even in a meeting each other way, treating each other as you, how much am I willing to do that? Where we go deeper enough where there's not just a relational connection being built or a trust involving connection being built, but there's also something epistemic. There's something related to knowledge that's, I think, being tracked when we say, I know her, or she knows him, where that usually flags you have some sort of relationship, or you've at least met, where the meeting involves the not just introducing with names, but like, right, treating each other in a certain kind of way, where it's a give and take, reciprocation. And of course, we almost forget that this is relevant to it. I have to remember things about the person I've met. There's a way in which I might treat someone as a you. Maybe I'm very busy, or I'm a famous person, or I'm like whatever. But you can imagine celebrities to fans or something. There's a parasocial relationship question here. But I think we should say in those, like fans might know a lot about the celebrity, and the celebrity doesn't know anything about them. But also, if they did meet, like in a, I don't know, VIP room in a concert or whatever, like they'll meet each other for a second, and that for the fan it will mean they are like getting to treat someone as a you, my hero, not my hero, but I'm a big fan of your work and this is crazy, I'm getting to meet you. But usually the reverse is, well, they meet a fan but they don't remember who they were, they don't remember even the occasion of meeting. And so in those kinds of exchanges, they don't have to involve celebrities or busy people or anything like that. But you can meet someone and then forget who they are, and forget even what they look like, or attach a kind of a name you learned about them to their face, or be able to recognize them again, or come back to what did we talk about before. The building of that feels related to good relationships, or at least minimally possible relationships. So this all seems to matter for what extra thing it takes to get to know someone. You and they have to treat each other as yous in a certain kind of minimal way, and there has to be a kind of remembering and caring enough to remember. But now here's one of the interesting things that I sometimes bring up in this work. You can also know someone in a relational way or have a minimal kind of interactions with them and know a lot about them, know facts about them, but sometimes those can come apart. The case I use in the paper a lot of times is this Mary Jane Peter Parker case from the Spider-Man story, where I'm not sure this is exactly how the Spider-Man story begins, or at least in most of the versions of it, but imagine Mary Jane, and she knows Peter Parker. Personally, they're like friends at school, whatever. But suppose she never, at the start anyway, she thinks there is no Spider-Man. She thinks this is BS. There's no flying superhero. I hear these stories. And
any video footage is just created by AI.
Right. She might go conspiracy theoretic on the superhero guy and say that she might have a belief there is no such person as Spider-Man. But what we ought to say is she knows Peter Parker personally, or in my labeling, interpersonal knowledge, has an interpersonal knowledge of that guy, and he knows her. I think of them as usually being a two-way symmetric thing. So they know each other. And if you asked her, do you know Spider-Man? She'd say no. But she'd be wrong. Because Peter Parker is Spider-Man, she knows personally Spider-Man. And this holds all over the place. Like, I might know, I don't know, take an example where this guy in retirement moves to Wyoming. He has a famous face, but the people he meets there haven't paid much attention to global affairs or anything. It turns out it's like Barack Obama or whatever. And they just don't recognize him. And he's actually moving there because he wants to get away from he wants to have normal relationships that are not fraught with you were a politician and president and you were, you can imagine where someone couldn't get to know him in a relational way without ever knowing these really, what we might call essential facts about him, or like things that are really importantly, deeply connected to who he is, right? That kind of thing raises up a deep question about, are there any essential facts about us that to know someone well or deeply, those are things you better learn, or that they better share, right? I tend to suppose that's not a real thing, but we operate psychologically as if there are certain essential things one knows, and then I can compare. I know him better than you if you haven't learned this, right? I might then later also, just like we have practical knowledge of a skill, like knowing how to ride a bike is like a skill. Knowing how to throw a football is a skill. Mm-hmm. Well, what about this IU treating someone second personally? There's a way in which if you do that well, that can be a skill. There's interpersonal competence in how you relate to someone, how you're good at remembering things about them propositionally or qualitatively. So that's mostly the human level version.
I don't think I can accurately summarize all that, but just some highlights. There's something epistemic going on when we say we know someone as opposed to just knowing a lot about somebody. There's something epistemic going on, and so you're trying to dig in and say, what's the epistemic part that we're tracking when we use that kind of language? And you threw out a couple of candidate options, both of these things. You think both, at minimum, these are required. There might be more required to say that you really know someone, but at least these two. One, I don't think this was your language, but I'm interpreting what you're saying. It's a kind of reciprocal engagement. You're engaging with me, and I'm engaging back with you. If you were only engaging with me, and I just didn't acknowledge you at all, just totally ignored you, it's hard for you to say that you know me. Mm. The second thing was treating you as a you. But this doesn't require conversation. And the dog case might be a useful example. Like, I have a small pet, and every night at 10 p.m., my dog goes and stands at the top of my steps right at 10 p.m., perfect internal clock, and lets out like a roof. And I just know she's saying, it's time to go to bed. Like, come up. I'm tired of being downstairs. Like, I want to go to bed now, and I'm not going to be alone. Like, come up here. So even though there are no words there, and sometimes I can just, from the look, like, she can just look at me and I know, or she can look at the cabinet or something and I know, she wants one of those. She's asking me to get one of those dog treats out. I liked how you offered a couple cases that show that these things can come apart between knowing a lot of true things about somebody and actually knowing them. Yeah. So you can know someone but have a bunch of false beliefs about them. And you can know a lot of true things about someone, but not know them fully.
Right.
On average, we spend about 1/3 of our lives at work. That's a huge chunk of your life. So you should choose a career that is meaningful and impactful, especially if you're a Christian. We're called to be good stewards of the talents and time that God has given us. So which careers should you consider? How about the ones that are aimed at solving some of the world's most pressing problems? And if you make one of those careers your goal, what specific steps do you need to take to get there? These questions can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing if you're trying to figure all of this out alone. But you don't have to. There's a program that can help. Christians for Impact is a charity designed to help Christians with career discernment. They have over 50 experienced mentors who will pray with you one-on-one, help you map out a career plan, and connect you with hundreds of Christian professionals. You might be thinking, this sounds awesome, but how much does it cost? Well, this is the most amazing part. This mentorship program is completely free. How does it work? Just spend 10 minutes reading the career guide linked in the description below. At the end of that career guide, you'll see a link to apply for a free one-on-one mentorship. After submitting your application, you'll hear a response within 1 to 2 weeks, connecting you with a career mentor. If you're a committed Christian based in the US or the UK, especially if you're between the ages of 18 and 25, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss. So check out the career guide linked in the description below and apply today. While you're there, check out the Christians for Impact newsletter and podcast. Both will provide you with even more resources to help you start navigating your career journey today.
So now that we've thought about this in the human terms, by the way, I like this sort of methodology, I guess, of thinking about the phenomena in question at the human level and then seeing if that applies at all at the level of humans and God. I know, for example, like when it comes to the atonement, a lot of how we think about how atonement works, we think, I've interviewed Dr. Josh Thorough a few times, and I've also interviewed Richard Swinburne on this. That's part of the methodology, is we think about how it is that humans atone with one another, and then we think, can that map onto our relationship with God? So I'm a fan of this sort of methodology. Now, let's apply this to God. With all that in mind, what does it take to know God as opposed to just knowing a lot about God?
Right, good. So the same sorts of lessons are hopefully going to carry over. I think we should be alert to bits in which we may want to slightly finesse some things here, or because if it's like an analogy, we're going to have to say there might be parts where the human situation is incomplete, or actually there might be parts where the human version is easier or more complete, because at least in the epistemic sense, because in most cases you probably want to say, I have a good grip on who my friends are, who I know, how deeply or how well I know them, how I feel about them, how they feel about me. And you might carry that over to the God case and be like, I feel very in the dark about how this works, or if God's responding, or, a whole bunch of, it's a different situation when it's an unembodied, invisible God. But the interesting thing is, like, you might still make room. The part of the project of this book is to, in a way, make room for ways in which you still could have a bunch of propositional knowledge and maybe a bunch of qualitative knowledge of God. You might also have interpersonal knowledge, but you still have these features of the fragmenting thing available, where I might have certain guises under which I am thinking about God, or modes of representing God, where I'm getting some things wrong, but it'd be bizarre to suppose you must know all these manner of facts first, or that like restricts whether you could know God interpersonally. Just like in the human case, that doesn't apply. So the language I use in the book is sometimes your knowing someone is autonomous with respect to whether various facts about them. Like there's no fact needing to be known such that's sufficient, or like even maybe required, to know them personally or interpersonally. And the one interesting one, which we can bring up and discuss if you want, but is, don't I even need to believe that they exist or know that they exist? And I mean,
yeah, we're getting to that.
Newsflash, it might be that you don't need to know that they exist and still be able to know. Just like someone could, take the Mary Jane and Peter Parker case. She, under certain guise or mode of presentation, she denies the existence of the guy whom she in fact knows personally. So in the God case, at least let's make room for this. The ways by which you might know some facts about God are going to be somewhat the same. You could know facts by testimony. Maybe if some monotheistic tradition like Judaism or Christianity or Islam or something is mostly true or the most true one, that the sacred texts, the scriptures, are somehow like a divine communication to us, where maybe that some of that is God standing way in which God is available to treat us or talk to us, but maybe it's more like, apart from the treating or talking or second personally relating thing, maybe we can learn a bunch of facts by testimony that God did these things, like in history, or that God's real, or something more basic. So testimony is one means. Maybe sensory perception, or an analog of it in the God case, will be like a religious experience case. So maybe those are two avenues by which you could come to know that God is, or that God's a certain way, or has certain attributes or features. Then, I mean, the special one that many theists will allow is by reason. Maybe you can just use reason to at least learn God's existence or God's nature. That God's real, God would have to have these properties, right? So you can reason your way to certain things, perhaps. So there's lots of ways by which you could gain propositional knowledge. And you could notice you could have all those, again, just like the human case. You could have knowledge like that, maybe even pretty stable. Maybe you could have a deep, somewhat rich understanding of who God is, what God's done, but without ever treating God as a you, or relating to God in a second personal way. And so let's just dress up that individual. Let's suppose there's someone who's like a good philosopher, a good intellectual, like they've thought about this and studied this a lot. Maybe they know a bunch of facts. There's like an intellectual theist in a way or something. And we have to spot ourselves then. And let's suppose there is a God. Then it's a fact that can be known by that person, and several facts that can be known by that person. Maybe they have no devoted or religious life or no prayer life or anything like that. And let's suppose that what that partly amounts to is they've never tried to treat God as a you. They've never they never prayed to God or tried to relate in a personal way or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So that's a possibility. I think that's pretty common for some people. And maybe in some cases, what's driving that might be like, it's harder for me to feel like I can relate because I'm more used to the human situation. And I also never heard, like maybe I expected God to show up first, as it were, or like, speak to me as the you first, or maybe they don't think of scripture or any other way of like God's getting at you as a you or speaking to you. If you have expectations of like rich religious experiences and you need that or something, then you might be like, I guess I don't know God in that way, but I know a lot about God. But you can have then also someone who's got a rich, deep devotional life, whose prayer life, they're like speaking and relating to God, engaging in liturgy or like worship in which it's toward God as a you. And then they have what feels like a reciprocation if God responds. Maybe God doesn't respond in the exact same way, of course. It's not like God sings worship songs to us, or it's not, but God maybe sometimes people feel like God's speaking to them, maybe not in words, maybe sometimes with like words. But however we gloss those examples, it looks like it's supposed to be a way for God to respond, or maybe be the first one who's, I see you, I love you, I forgive you, all the things that are like God to us as you. But notice, it seems possible that someone could have a bunch of that, but lack a bunch of propositional knowledge about God, even not maybe have good qualitative knowledge. I mean, what's a quality of God that someone might not have, but nevertheless have the other thing? Like, they might not grasp, at least maybe not yet, that God is love or loving, or they might not grasp that God is all powerful, or take the philosopher's God, as it were, all the omni attributes. Maybe
I would imagine a lot of people in the pews at the churches that I go to don't think of, they might not really know that God exists necessarily. And I know that there's going to be people that are like, God doesn't exist necessarily. I'm not thinking of that. I'm thinking like, they don't even think of these kinds of categories of whether he exists necessarily or contingently or something like that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the relevant human, I suppose, analog is there's someone who might be friends with someone, but might not pay much attention to a bunch of things about them. They only connect over their relationship, but they're not trying to dig deep into the deep facts about who this person is. They're not like trying to be like a therapist or a psychologist or dig into their history or like anything. Like, That's just not their,
Yeah.
they don't need that. Those things might be interesting if to them, but they're not pursuing any such stuff. But in the God case compared to the human case, there's often this model or presupposed framework. I don't know that this is explicitly endorsed by even philosophers very much. Although I think some parts of the religious epistemology discussion in the 20th century is driven partly by this. But even like man on the street type situation where like, have they thought about this? Sometimes there's this thought that you have to know or at least believe that there's a being like God before any of that other stuff can come in. Like that's not even available to relate to God. And so often the common question is, do you believe there's a God? As if that's the foundational bit. And in one way, that is a foundational bit where like that might be the most general proposition you're committed to if you know there's a God, or if you facts about God, or if you even know God personally or something. Right? But it just seems to require some motivation or argument for the idea that like you got to first investigate whether there's a being like this, right? And sort that out and come to at least a justified or rational belief on your own terms. That's right. Before any of these other stuff is like worth pursuing or could be known, right? And so I'm partly in this project, in this book, what I'm trying to do is these are discrete sorts of knowledge. And sometimes the knowledge of existence comes for free when you get the other thing, or one other thing, right? Just like in the human affairs case too, you might not know there's a person called Susie. And the moment at which you come to see her or meet her is the first moment you learn of her existence. But you don't like probably form the belief explicitly. Oh, now I have this belief Susie exists.
Yeah.
Right? The more interesting thing are all the other ones. So in that way, it's a weird thing, a feature, I think, of philosophy and epistemology, of theism at least, that the way in tends to be, what are the arguments, or why do you think there's a being like this? And that's important to think about at some level for almost any, say, Christian or any theist. Surely you get equipped well to think about a bunch of issues when you examine that question. But it seems false to be like, I got to first decide and have good grounds for believing this, that there is this being, and then I get to roll on the rest, right? I get to, you might presuppose or engage with or think, well, just try. Like, you might be like, I don't know whether there's a being. Even the atheist or the agnostic might be like, they might deny there's a being, or they might be like, I'm not sure, I don't know what to say. But can they still engage in second personal address or like a prayer? Yeah. I mean, they could do at least the conditional one. God, if you're real, would you blah, 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 blah.
Right?
And you can have people, I think, who at one level we might not want to call them theists. At another level we might, but we might say a lot of people might go through much of their lives just like that. Like, it doesn't occur to them. They haven't thought it through, but in the hard moments, they might somehow do this prayer. Shall we say that's a way of relating to God? Probably. Shall we say God responds to that sometimes? Yes. Is it often the case that they misdiagnose what happened, that it was really God that showed up? Probably. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I want to say one thing about this, because this whole book is partly me also toying with getting clear on, in English, we say this kind of thing. Do you believe in God? Where what you might be meaning is, do you believe that there's a God? Mm-hmm. Or belief in talk can track the trust notion. Mm-hmm. We also say, so there's an ambiguity with that phrase, but then we also can say, do you have faith? What does that mean? Do you mean you trust God? Does that mean you have religious beliefs with religious content about God? Right? And then we get also, especially in evangelical Christian circles, but also other places too, you often get talk of people being like, I know God, I know this being, where they seem to be flagging the relational notion, this relating thing, but there's hardly any deep investigation of what do you mean by that? Are there different concepts being like brought together, or can we pull them apart? Can we learn something about the intellectual philosopher's side of sorting this out? But can we also shed light on what does faith involve? Or can we think about it in a different kind of way, where someone might know something about God without being a person of faith? Maybe they're not yet recognizing or having their modes of presentation or their guises, they're not aligned in the right way because things are fragmented for them. Maybe they relate to God all the time in some weird way that they wouldn't call that, but is like the Mary Jane Peter Parker case, where under a certain description, they'd be like, no, there's no being like that. But in another way, the way philosophers sometimes distinguish between de re and de dicto knowledge, they might believe of God, that they experience God, but they have a different understanding of what it was they experienced, that it wasn't God. Right? So they might have a kind of de re knowledge of God. And there's a nice quote Plantinga gives in there. So you might have an experience that you don't attribute to God, and you in fact deny there's a God, but it might be an experience of God. So a way in which you had an experience of God may be trying to get, but it also might be God maybe less so cares about you getting the right guises and descriptions in place, and that you respond in certain ways. So in the book, there's also this interesting bit about, I don't know that there's much mileage in this idea, by the way, but I'm reaching for this in this one moment where I'm like, if God is just the good, and we go with Robert Adams has this book, Finite and Infinite Goods, where he tries to develop this really in detail. He's thinking in this Platonic way, like God is like the good, and resembling God or anything that's excellent plays a kind of participating in goodness, the goodness which is just God. And that in a way, everything that's good is a participation in and a reflection of God. If you take that to a certain, maybe extreme, but to a certain distance, you can say, maybe it's the case that anything good in creation is a way of experiencing God. And there are some things we will actually get wrong about what's good, right? I mean, we can get that wrong. But there might be things that are really of God and worthy of our calling them goodness. Like aesthetic goodness and moral goodness feel like they're really related to this. Beauty. Like a lot of people might say, I experience God when I see this beautiful creation or the sunset or whatever it is, right? And then there might be someone else who experiences that exact same thing, but they're not a theist. Maybe they for other social reasons they're like just cannot be a theist. They can't. They reject the church or whatever. Okay, fine. But we might well say they know and can recognize goodness, which is in fact turns out that's God. So in a way, I think this opens up a whole lot of ways of talking about both divine hiddenness, like God's hidden but there and available to be known in a certain manner, objectually, but maybe not needing propositional knowledge, or qualitatively or relationally, but maybe again lacking a certain propositional foundation. And I think that's valuable for talking about this invisible, hidden. I mean, God's hidden, but also it allows a lot of people there might be more an expansive notion of who's on a kind of good terms or like who believes or knows something about this being. It's maybe a separate question. What do we say? What amounts to, if you're thinking of salvation or say on a typical Christian story, you got to believe certain things, or you got to connect with Jesus or whatever it is in some way. But put all that to the side for the moment. Just be like, there might be plenty of people who like have a kind of understanding of God. They just again haven't connected. Oh, that really is God to what the things they are experiencing or the things they value or find valuable.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. No, this is very good. Let me throw some ideas out. I made a couple of notes. Let me start with this. So we gave the kind of human relationship, how one human knows another human. And then we're looking at how can any of this apply to God. So insofar as we are trying to use the same features that were going on in the human relationship and apply those in this case, in the God case, what I'm calling reciprocal engagement, like you've got to engage with one another. So when it comes to that feature, I'm thinking typically this would be done, I think a lot of people would think as I'm worshiping God, or like in song perhaps, or as I'm praying to God, me speaking to God as you. I mean, lots of our prayers are like, you're amazing, or whatever. Or when we sing these songs, like we're singing to God, we'll call him you. So that's on our part. And then you said many things. One of the things that you said, I think, would be for this to be reciprocal, God's speaking to that person as well, or at least engaging with, that's the point, engaging with that person in some way. So it might be through a religious experience that's like completely nonverbal, or not even like a little voice in your head. You just are maybe.
Yeah.
I've done an interview on this recently with, I think his name's Noah McKay. He's got a new paper out on aesthetic experience, and he talks about this
Okay.
experience of awe and wonder. Like, I
Yeah.
can be filled with awe and wonder, and nothing. I'm not even hearing like a little voice in my head that's I
Yeah.
think is God speaking to me. I can just be filled with that awe and wonder, and it's just a kind of an awareness, I guess, of
Yeah.
the majesty or the glory or something about God, the holiness. You might be just tracking something about God, the
Yeah.
presence of this person, and
Right.
that's a way of engaging with them, even if there's nothing that was spoken. Other people might have maybe a different sort of experience and be like, no, I actually feel like God did speak to me at this particular time. And it's not even that this goes on like nonstop, as though it's as easy as my wife and I say. We talk to each other all the time. It might not even be like that. It can be something that's periodic, just comes here and there. Correct, fill in anything you want. I had one more suggestion of how God might engage with us. And so some people might say, well, when I'm reading scripture or when I'm doing the liturgy, that is God on a regular basis engaging with me. I'm
Yeah.
hearing his words through these practices.
Yeah.
And so that's God engaging with me as well. So I guess all those would count as the reciprocal engagement feature. Before I move to the second one, the you part, which I guess I don't really have much to say about that. Like when you're reading, at least I know like liturgical prayers, like when I'm reading these sorts of things, lots of times it's the languages in terms of us, but like I'm included in that group of people. So I feel like it's still a
Yeah.
speech to me,
Right.
something like that.
No,
So
that's right. In fact, I think we'd notice to the extent that we have experience with various liturgies, or I don't think it needs to be a scripted liturgy in the same way, but those are easier to look up, as it were, in a prayer book,
yeah,
or a certain more high church tradition will have the Anglican or Church of England, or the Orthodox traditions. You would notice in a case where someone tried to write up one where there's almost no version of speaking to God as you.
mm-hmm.
It would be an awkward thing to be like just like describing God in the absence of attributing the relevant. Usually the collects in the English tradition are written in a very specific way where it's like, "O Lord God, you who are of such and
Right,
such."
right, yeah,
And then you eventually get to whatever it is, the real point of the whole claim or the statement or the request or whatever it is made. If any of your listeners are interested in this, there's a really great couple of, well, not just papers, but philosophers. Terence Cuneo has done stuff on ritual knowledge where he talks about this. Also, Nicholas Wolterstorff, especially in a collection of his papers recently called, I think I have it here, United in Love, where it's essays on justice, art, and liturgy. But toward the end, he's also written a book or two on liturgy. But in the essays toward the end here, one of them at least engages with some of my work on this, where he's talking about liturgical practices can be a way of knowing God or interacting with or relating to God. All this to highlight the you feature, treating God as you, is like central, it seems, to the orienting you mentally, as it were, toward a person, a someone.
yeah,
But let me go back to the point. So you just before that, you were drawing a distinction that I think is the right one to make, which is when I do this with other humans, like you say your wife or whatever, it's pretty back and forth, it's pretty reciprocating, it's pretty easy. And in the God case, it can sometimes feel a bit harder to identify. You might be reading your Bible, you might be engaged in a liturgical service. Maybe the response that you get that you might attribute to God, or say, God, that was God responding, or maybe it's merely like you have a weird feeling. The on wonder examples like this, where it's like almost contentless, but it's like an experience. So if you do some philosophy of mind on this, you'd be like, there's like qualitative experiences like of pain, but it has no content.
mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, it feels a certain way, right?
Yeah,
It's like but it doesn't have propositional content, is what I mean.
right, right.
Whereas all these other mental states, like propositional attitudes, do have a proposition as its content. Even when you're asking questions or engaging in inquiry or like wondering, it always has like propositional, it's related to propositions. These other things not. But when you said the thing about relating to your wife, like human ones are much easier for us to track, that we're engaged in them. And that's why this Mary Jane, Peter Parker, or like examples where things can be fragmented is almost surprising, because we're like, oh, I didn't realize that I forgot that these are really easy, good cases most of the time. There's this feature of interpersonal knowing or relating to someone as a you where it feels like you can't have someone do it for you. It's like you have to experience it and try yourself, right? So you couldn't get away with, I have my friend speak to my wife on my behalf as the you. That's not really going to work. And you couldn't ever know someone by a third party. Like, no manner of you describing some bits about your relationship with your friend are going to let me count as knowing your friend, right? It just doesn't, it's not the kind of thing that transmits, as it were,
So that's
across. But now here's the thing I think is fascinating that we could play with, or someone could bring up. I don't think I'd raise it in these terms in the book, but in a paper I wrote one time, I was playing with it on a paper related to divine hiddenness and interpersonal hiddenness, which is, what if there's a way in which God does transmit to us God's way of speaking or relating to us as a you, but through someone else?
Yeah.
I think it's a common thing for religious people sometimes to be like, or at least Christians anyway, sometimes to be like, God, I was having this conversation with my friend. They helped me to see something, and it felt like God was speaking to me, like through what they said.
Right. Yeah.
Well, there's sometimes an explicit word, right? Someone has a dream or they give it to you. I think this is for you to know something, right?
Right.
What if that's like a way in which God's relating to us is very different from the interpersonal human knowing each other ways? But also that's a way to make sense of the two commandments, which are like, what's the greatest commandment? Is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. But where in lots of passages, even in the Gospels, it's like Jesus is saying, you love me by loving your neighbor. That's a way of relating to me. I think Matthew 25 and the sheep and the goats passage is very explicit about this.
That's what I was going to ask. It seems like he's relating to people. You can finish the point. It was just, if you've done it to the least of these,
right,
then you've done it to me. And then he adds,
and I didn't know you. I don't know you.
Yeah, like it's when you didn't do it for the least of these that I never knew you.
Yeah.
So it seems, hey, if I know that person over there, that human being over there, and I've treated them, if I know them really well and I've treated them well, then I know Christ. Like, he knows, and he knows me. It's not just I know him, he knows me.
Right.
Okay, anyway, you can finish your point. That was one I was going to ask you.
That was it. I mean, it's a creative, perhaps newish idea to put these together in this way, to think about, at least among philosophers. I mean, surely theologians and mystical writers have already covered this train in some places. But can I know God by loving other people? And can someone who doesn't think there's a God nevertheless somehow connect with and know God in a different manner, know God? I mean, there's this, sometimes these passages are more fanciful than, or like taking poetic license, but like in 1 John, I think it's 1 John 4, somewhere I have a footnote in the book where I mention this. There's this thing, it's love God. How does it go? Let me just make sure I get it right. Love is from God, right? The passage is the one that says, love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God.
Oh, right, yes.
For God is love, right? And it seems like it's drawing a pretty tight connection there to say, if you don't know, I think it even says explicitly, if you don't love others, you don't know God. But if you love others, you do know God. It's like, what? What is that? Like, other passages of Scripture don't invoke it in that way. But if you're interpreting Scripture in light of other parts of Scripture, it sure looks like that's engaging with this idea that it's harder to love someone without treating them as a you in an interesting, deep, rich way. Can I love someone by caring for them from afar? I mean, kind of. Maybe I send them a gift. And I maybe even don't let them know who it came from. I just caring for and providing for their needs or something. Okay. That's a loving move, but the sort of love we have in mind tends to be more like it's face-to-face. It's in person. I'm helping you now, or I'm with you now in the hurt or whatever it is, right? So, I don't know. That's, in a way, that's not a philosophy epistemology point quite, but that feels like it's right in there, because that's a way by which we can know each other and know God better or something, or that's available to enhance it somehow. Just like I could know you imperfectly by just being pen pals, or you could get to know your wife over the phone, but the in-person face-to-face thing brings all this richer stuff, and it makes available all these like interpersonal abilities where we relate to each other. We can triangulate on topics, things we do together. These are all constructed out of I, you, I, us, we, ways of kind of almost like it's a social coordination problem, but it's relational and it's epistemic too. Sorry,
Yeah.
that's a long-winded
No,
set of
this was
ideas,
good.
but yeah.
I want to finish up with the last question because you already touched on, can you know God even if you don't believe in God? And I've done an interview. I forgot the name at this point. I'll make sure I splice it in correctly. I've done an interview where there's some guy, I think he's at the University of Cincinnati now. He's Andrew Moon's friend. Gosh, I cannot remember his name. Anyway, he wrote a paper responding to the divine hiddenness argument by
Is
pointing
it
out.
Andrew Cullison?
That's probably right. That sounds right.
It might be him.
So I did an interview with him where he looks at specific cases where it's you don't actually have to believe that the person exists in order to be in relationship with that person.
Right.
So I can just direct people to that. I want to jump to the fourth question I had, which was how this relates to faith in God. So yeah, I guess elaborate on that. How knowing would relate to faith.
There's a whole literature, and of course you've probably seen some of it, talked to folks like Liz or others who have written a bunch on this. There's a whole, especially in the last 15, 20 years, by analytic philosophers of religion, talking about what is faith. And usually it's, not always, but it often is like propositional faith. What does it have faith in a proposition? Is that different than belief in a proposition? Or is it different than acceptance? Okay, so there's some of that. And then you can have faith maybe grounded in hope, or you can do so I'm in this last chapter of this book, I actually venture into this a little bit without weighing in on those exact things. And I'm thinking, let's identify a particular, maybe less explored idea about interpersonal faith, where I'm taking the resources of the IU second personal interaction stuff from I'm calling this interpersonal epistemology. I'm saying, can we deploy those resources to talk about what faith involves? And what I get to is like a way of talking about how faith in someone, it's interpersonal, where it's again going to apply to people as well as to God, human people versus also God. But take the theistic case of God, you would be basically treating God as a you in a certain way, where what that does is it's connected deeply to your affective response to God. Like you at least care about God. And so there's like love is related to this in at least some deep enough way where maybe it's not the emotive, loving sort of feeling, but it might be like, I know God cares about me and I care about God. And I might want to respond in the way God needs me to or expects me to. But the more interesting thing I'm highlighting in that is that there's the love part, but there's also then trust. So when we say faith in someone, we tend to flag this thing about trust. And when we speak of it in theistic traditions or in the Christian tradition, it's really hard to be like, I have faith in God, but I don't trust God. That wouldn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pointing out like there's an interpersonal version of this that's related to God. I trust you, right? And we would say this in prayer maybe, or we would rehearse it in our minds if we feel like we're trying to connect to God. And there's a way in which we can talk about less mature and then more mature versions of this. So I have this picture on which, well, the immature or less mature version is God. It's what in the trust literature sometimes called a three-place relation of trust. Like whoever it is, S trusts someone Y with respect to some matter X or P. So that's the three-place, like someone trusts someone for something or with respect to some matter. And in the immature starting off bit, you might be like, if in the theistic version, you might say, I trust God, I trust you. In a certain kind of prayer life where it's, again, immature maybe, you're like, God, I trust you about this. I have this, I really need you to come through for me, whatever, with this. You're asking for intercession. You're asking for God's, to engage with or save the situation, whatever it is, God to show up or God to intervene, whatever. And now there's a thing where like that's a kind of way of putting faith in God. But I think you also want to make room for how that can mature over time, where you don't just trust God with respect to certain things you have in mind that you care about and might bring to God, but it can move from a three-place relation to a two-place one where it's merely, God, I trust you. End. Stop. Full stop. Where you don't need to have in mind only things that are of interest to you. You just have a two-person like Lord, God, I trust you kind of thing. And it doesn't mean you'd never bring up things that you might need to talk to God about or relate to God over. But the idea is, about what do you trust God? If you trust God only with respect to some things, that's not as mature as if you trust God in general. Right? Mm-hmm. But there's a second personal element of it, which is it would be very awkward for someone to claim to trust God or have faith in God, but never ever be able to say to God, I trust you. You take a human case where it's maybe from afar, someone you don't really know or anything like that. You might be like, I trust this leader to do the right thing, or you can even talk about trusting institutions or trusting, it's like, who exactly are you trusting is a difficult question for some of those. But there's a way in which that is like from a distance picture. But with the God version, it'd be awkward to have it from a distance where you're just like, you never say to God, I trust you, but you rehearse in your mind, I trust God with respect to this. I trust God with respect to that. Yeah, but you're like speaking third personally about this.
Right. Being, that would be really weird.
You're supposed to be like youing or thouing God on it. Uh-huh. So I'm basically telling a story about, I don't think it's the only way to talk about faith. There's basically lots of different ideas about what faith involves. And maybe in an ideal model, a bunch of these come together. But the bit I'm highlighting is like, there's a second personally loaded interpersonal faith in that's with especially tracking a thing about trust and about how much you trust. And so the quantifier with respect to this, with respect to that, Lord God, I trust you. Like, how many things would I quantify over in the logical sense of with respect to some things or with respect to all things? Like, the more you can open up the things you will trust God with as a you, then that's an account of maturing in faith, in this faith in someone, faith in God notion. That's the gist of it. That comes at the very end of the book, and it's only several pages long chapter, but I'm sketching a little thing that I think maybe hasn't been said quite like that yet. But it's connected to this interpersonal stuff in a pretty deep way.
Yeah. I guess one last thing I was considering, I was trying to think on the fly, for somebody that, suppose there's someone that knows God but doesn't believe in God. I was thinking, is it the case that they would be able to have faith in God, knows them in the interpersonal way? Yes. Knows them in an interpersonal way.
So be like someone who doesn't quite trust God, but somehow is able to relate to God. Is that the idea?
Well, I'm wondering, is it the case that somebody can know God interpersonally and have interpersonal faith in God, but not believe that God exists? Because such a person, that would be difficult to be like, I trust you because I don't believe you are there.
Right. So
you see,
good. I see that. Yes, I don't exactly spell this out in detail, but I think my picture is assuming that the mode under which you'd start speaking or relating to God as a you in the first place will almost always be one where you at least believe there's that being that you're doing this to. Mm-hmm. That's not a requirement, because remember what I mentioned, that agnostic or something might have the conditional structured prayer like, God, if you're real, would you blah, blah, blah. So, but you can only probably do that version of things so much before you're just assuming there's a you that it's hitting, or like it's hitting the mark of that. That's who we're talking to.
Or in the Mary, yeah, maybe the way I'll answer my own question. Tell me what you think about this. I'm thinking of the Mary Jane case and relating that to like the Matthew stuff about I never knew you. So it's if this person that I'm imagining, this hypothetical person that knows God interpersonally and can even have interpersonal faith in God but doesn't believe God exists, perhaps it's the case that they know this person over here, this human, that they say, I know them and I have trust in them, and they're one of the least of these, and insofar as I know them and trust in them, then I, by virtue of that, know. Perhaps you could make a move like that, because similar to how Mary Jane could be like, I know Peter Parker and I have faith in Peter Parker, but I don't believe Spider-Man exists.
Good, right. So, part of the trick of this, right, is I've opened up a way in which you can get through to there's someone you do know. It's just you might have mistaken guises or beliefs about who it is. Mm-hmm. And you might even, in a strange case, deny they exist. But with respect to some guys, there's probably some guys under which you're like, yeah, that thing exists who I'm regarding or treating as you. But in the agnostic case, that person probably under every guise is, I'm not sure there's a being that answers to that. description under however we draw the description. Is it possible for them to go to do the, nevertheless, I trust you with respect to this, where that's enough of an attitude of, I don't know, you'd have to tell a story about what trust really amounts to, but if it's, I'm out of control, I'm surrendering this to you, I'm really hoping you either come through in the way I need, or at least if you don't, maybe I'll revise my preferences on this or whatever. And so I think, there's a way to say that someone could begin to meet that interpersonal faith, trust, at least the 3-place thing. But I think it will just naturally tend to be that someone who does very much of that at least has some guys under which they're willing to entertain that there really could be someone there, or at least maybe I think there is someone there. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it's impossible, but I think in the wide range of the most natural cases, it's much more difficult to have this interpersonal faith thing where it does the sort of, I guess, mental work you need to be engaging it in the first place. If you're also like, no, you just deny every claim, every description under which you think that's something that's
right.
So it's like, the point is then it's hard to treat someone as a you if you really have no idea whether there's a you.
Right, exactly.
You're just like, and in fact, if you're dead set against it, there's a way in which it's harder to make sense of that. But I don't think it's entirely closed off. So I guess that's an incomplete kind of way of trying to answer it, but it's driving in a certain direction where faith seems to involve some kind of commitment of that, some sort. But I don't think it means you have to know God personally. I don't think it means you have to know propositionally that God exists, but you might probably need to accept or believe or allow that being could be there. Mm-hmm. It'd be hard to be an atheist than to be an agnostic and pull that off, is I guess what it means.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I enjoyed reading the book.